How about a big hand for Matt Isaac, everybody, Professor of Marketing at the University of Washington.
All right. Well, it's tough to follow all of that, but I'll do my best here. So actually, I was most impressed, I think, with Leah because she's an academic and she came out here and she talked to you without any PowerPoint, and that is something that we don't do. If you're an academic, you need to just use PowerPoint. And in fact, I have this clicker right now, and in fact, it's not working, but I need it. I need to have it in my hand, and I need to just point, even though I'm totally relying on Josh right now in the back to help me by advancing these slides. But without this clicker and without this PowerPoint, I don't know what I would do. So you're getting your money's worth because you're getting an academic who's using PowerPoint and a clicker, even if it doesn't work. Okay, so I'm going to be talking to you today about some of my work that looks at the psychology of lists. And when I'm talking about lists, I'm talking about information that is ordered, and typically it's been ranked. So I'm going to point here and press on my clicker, and here's some magic. Here are some examples of lists. So some people sometimes ask me, why do you do research on lists? And the short answer is they're everywhere. We encounter these kinds of lists all the time. I'll point again. More lists. So there's lists everywhere. And not only that, people love lists. You can see that as we continue on. Here's an example of something called a listicle. So there's actually a word for this. It's a listicle. It's a combination of an article and a list. Listicle. And we see this online all the time. Has anyone actually seen this listicle from BuzzFeed? 21 pictures that'll restore your faith in humanity. Has anyone seen this? Well, some of you have. Well, it got 20 million views. So that gives you an idea of how much people love lists. And there's lots of reasons why people love lists. But one of the reasons is that it organizes information for us, right? It takes all of this information and it puts it into this nicely packaged form that we can understand. We see things ordered and ranked, and that gives us some order and structure, and we like that, right? So that's why we love lists. And so that's usually what I tell people when they ask me, why do you study lists? But I'm going to let you since this is a different kind of audience, I'm going to let you in on a secret. That's not really why I started studying lists. So here's why. Go to the next slide. Maybe. One more. This guy. This is the person. This is the reason that I started studying lists. Does anyone know who this is? Casey Kasem. That's right. So for those who don't know, we can go on. So this is an American disc jockey, and he's also the man who taught us how to count backwards from 40. Every weekend he would air the American Top 40. And when I was a kid, I would sit there every weekend and I would listen, and I was mesmerized just listening to the top 40 countdown, going from the 40 songs down from number 40 all the way down to number 1. I thought it was amazing. And that might tell you a lot about me, right? But it gets better, because not only did I listen every weekend to Casey Kasem, I had a notebook. And in my notebook, I would sit there and I would write down the songs. And then every weekend I would look at how the songs moved one week to the other, from one position to the next. So as you can imagine, I was an extremely popular child, right? And now I know you're saying that this can't be true. There's no one that could be this cool. So I'm going to show you something that my mother saved. It's because she saves everything I do. And this is a list from the late 80s. And so if you go one more, you'll see that the number 1 song at this time was the Bangles' Walk Like an Egyptian. So you get an idea for this. I can't make this up. I was born to study lists. Okay. So there's all of these lists that are out there, and I'm going to talk to you now about a couple of different projects. So I've actually managed to do not just one paper, but I've got 3 different papers that looks at the effects of lists and how consumers respond to these lists. And I think the interesting thing is that we are really affected by this. There's even a paper out that shows that lists of business schools, so where a business school ranks in a list, affects dean turnover. So I love sharing that with my dean. But so this is information that's used, and consumers really like to use this information too. So I'm going to start by talking about the first project, and hopefully, so the first project is something called the top 10 effect. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about it. All right, so I thought I'd actually start, since I was coming here, I thought I'd see if the Tacoma Comedy Club was ranked, and guess what? At least on this one list online, the Tacoma Comedy Club is ranked number 1 out of 29 clubs. So let's give it up for the Tacoma Comedy Club. Okay. So my question was, well, how do we actually translate these kinds of ranks that we see? We see a list, we see a rank, and then eventually we're going to get to an evaluation and then maybe some sort of decision, like whether to come to the club. And so my question was, how do we actually translate these ranks into evaluations? And it makes sense that if you see a list, of course, something that's ranked number 1 on the list might translate to the highest evaluation. But the question was, well, what about if you're ranked number 2, number 3, and so forth? Okay, so let's see. There's some options. So I'm going to give you this example. This is a list of 15 places, the top 15 places to work. And suppose that you encounter this list, and you're trying to come up with an evaluation for the different items that are on this list. Well, one way you might think about doing that is something like this, where even though lists are ordinal, meaning there's nothing communicated about the gap between number 1 and number 2 and number 2 and number 3, we might just assume that the distance is the same. So of course, 1 is better than 2, which is better than 3, all the way down to 15. And we might just assume that the distance, the evaluative gap between those, is the same, right? That seems like a reasonable assumption. But that's not what my co-author and I thought might happen. And so instead, we had a different hypothesis. And that hypothesis, there's the X, the hypothesis that we had was based on some work from Gestalt psychology from the early 1900s. And this work suggests that we really like to take information and put it into buckets or categories. And so even when we see this array, these arrays of dots, we're trying to make sense of it. We're trying to put it into groups. So you might take the dots here on the left, and you might form 2 or 3 different groups or categories from it. And even the dots on the right, you might form groups of rows or categories. So we're always trying to make sense of our world. And we thought, when you get a big list of items, maybe we do the same thing. Maybe we want to group or categorize those items as well. And who knows, maybe by grouping in our mind, so we call that mental partitioning, maybe that mental partitioning might actually affect our evaluations in a way that isn't linear, where you don't have the same interval between each of the items. And that's what we found in a series of experiments. So just to show you this visually, you can imagine, you can imagine that rather than there being the same space between these items, I've got my animation right here. Ooh. You see that there's a shift that happens, and actually what we find is between 11 and 10, for example, but also between, say, 26 and 25, between 21 and 20, there's this big evaluative gap where people seem to see a big difference between items, even though they're 1 position apart. And the reason is because they've entered into a new tier, a new category that we've mentally created for ourselves. And so because of that, we actually evaluate them differently. Okay? And the cool thing about that is we find that where even if the position change is greater, if, say, you move from 14 to 11, that's a 3-position change, but that may not move the needle very much on your evaluation. But moving across one of these special tiers or thresholds seems to make a big effect, seems to have a big effect on the evaluations that we have of these items. So why does this happen? And Well, you saw the hands for a second there, but the reason, it has to do with how we learn how to count, right? Using our 10 fingers, 5 fingers on each hand. So, oh, there it is. So using that, that's how we've kind of come to use these kind of round numbers as cognitive reference points. So they're really accessible to us. And so when we get a big list, we're trying to make sense of it, and we form these buckets or these categories right at these partitions or these boundaries, and that affects our evaluations. The really interesting thing is, in this paper, we actually looked at applications to business schools, and we looked at the US News and World Report, which ranks business schools every year, and we found that when schools cross one of these round number tiers, we see a big spike in applications. But even if there's a bigger movement, if it doesn't cross one of these tiers, we don't see much effect on applications. So this seems to have some real world significance as well. All right, so that was very quickly the first project. So I'm gonna give you a quick elevator pitch on 2 other rank-related projects. One is something called the comfort tier effect. And the idea here is, well, in a lot of cases, we don't actually see the whole list. I mean, how many of you actually go and looked at the entire list? Instead, we just see a marketer's claim about where they are in a list, right? And so in this case, Loyola University uses, I would call, a fairly imprecise claim. They just say, hey, the bottom line is we're in the top 20, right? But that's up to the marketer to decide how they want to communicate the claim. They could be precise. In this case, I think they were number 18. They could have said, hey, we're number 18, which is pretty good. Or they could use one of these more imprecise claims. And so what we wanted to understand was how consumers respond to these different types of claims. And so we tested this in a number of experiments, but just to give you an idea, here's an example, and assume you're number 9, you're Acura in this list of Edmunds of the top 10 vehicles. Well, you have some options, right, as a marketer. How do I want to present myself in my advertising or online? Well, one way, as I just said, you could, there's a couple here, excuse all the animation, I'm clicking. You could say you're ranked exactly number 9. You could say you're ranked in the top 10. You could even say this, right? It's not wrong. You could say I'm ranked in the top 9. And in some way, that's actually more favorable than top 10 because you can't be number 10 if you're in the top 9. So that objectively should be superior. But is that how consumers actually process this information? Well, we tested this in a number of experiments. And here's what we found. So we found that all of these, saying you're part of this elite group is a good thing, right? It's better than not saying it. It's kind of like a seal of approval or some award you got. So compared to not making a claim, it's beneficial to do that. But we found that being too precise, number 9, or this number 10, or I'm sorry, this top 9 doesn't do as well as actually using top 10 or one of these round number tiers. And why is that? Well, it's because if you're top 9, that's kind of weird, right? And people don't say that as much. And so you stop and you think about, well, wait a minute, what do you think the exact rank is of this item? It's probably 9 or maybe 8, but it's pretty low. And so that pulls down your evaluations. Whereas when you get a claim like this, top 10, you're just thinking to yourself, wow, that's good. And you give it a thumbs up, it boosts your evaluation, and you move on. So it's kind of a 2-part processing explanation, where here you're processing heuristically, you're just thinking quickly about it, and it boosts your evaluation. You don't go to a second layer of processing, which can have a negative effect on your evaluation here. So that's the comfort tier effect. Last but not least, I'm going to talk about another. You didn't think there was so much you could do about ranks and lists, did you? So I'm going to talk about a project on format neglect. And the basic idea, so the genesis of this project, I got an email from our VP of Communications. He said, a program, a college, was ranked number 31. How should we talk about it? Should we say we're in the top 40, or should we say we're in the top 15%? Right? So you've got different formats. You can either use a numerical format or you can use a percentage format. And so we wanted to test which would be better. And I'll just jump to the punchline. What we find is that if you, let's go with one more. I think we need some more. Let's put it all up here. Okay, so what we find is that when you have a small set size, those top 2 claims are exactly identical. Top 10 out of 50 and top 20% out of 50. they're the same, but we find that people respond more favorably to top 10 compared to top 20%. And down in the bottom, when you have a bigger set size, people, even though these two claims are the same, top 40 out of 200 and top 20%, people respond better to the percentage claim. And the reason is that we really focus on that nominal value, which is the number in the claim. So having that 20 or that really the smaller number goes a long way, and it affects evaluations. And in this paper, we ran a field experiment at Beecher's Cheese in Pike Place, and we found that actually when you advertise a cheese using a percentage versus a numerical format, you get different levels of sales as a result. So it actually seems to matter as well. I will stop there and just hopefully, I hope I've convinced you that lists are important and cool, and you've gained some appreciation. Thank you.